In the world of true crime, some cases are stranger than others. But some, well, they defy all logic and reason. Today, we'll be looking at 5 strange but true crime stories. A gray Hyundai iX35 is declared a crime scene, along with a house that doubles as a garbage dump. But there's something weird about this car. First off, the license plate is wrong. It's been switched out. When detectives took a closer look at the car, they found the Hyundai logo had also been swapped with a Toyota one that was made out of paper. Police had been looking for a missing person, 17-year-old Pheobe Bishop, and this strange car was their only lead. Phoebe had been on her way out of town, heading to the airport to catch a flight. But Phoebe would never reach the airport, and she wouldn't board her flight. And the search for this missing woman was now on. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week, often multiple times a week. So if you're interested in classic true crime, hit that subscribe button. It's 100% free and just lets you know when I post new cases. Phoebe Bishop, better known as Fee by her mom, Kylie Johnson, was born in Queensland, Australia. Phoebe was a lively, charismatic, and sassy young girl, as her mom, Kylie, states, and she kind of followed her own beat to life. Phoebe loved cars and traveling, and according to her boyfriend, 18-year-old Levi, she was very much into photography, so much so that Levi had bought her a digital camera and was going to give it to her the next time they met. Now, Phoebe had a complicated history with her family. Although we don't really know the details, at the time of this case, she wasn't actually living with her parents. It's reported that she didn't really have a stable childhood and that she and her sister Kaylee were working as cleaners in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, or the NDIS. Now, it's not confirmed whether Phoebe had a disability or not, but one of the requirements for working in the NDIS is that the person should have a disability caused by a permanent impairment. But ultimately, that's neither here nor there. According to Phoebe's sister Kaylee, the sisters were just looking for places to live together. But eventually, Phoebe moved out of the family home alone, and she ended up living with 2 housemates, a man named James Wood and a woman named Tanika Bromley, in a house in Gengin. Now, I want to stress that Phoebe didn't personally know Tanika and James. It was actually Phoebe's mom who previously worked with Tanika. So Phoebe and her 2 housemates, who were more acquaintances or strangers to her, were now living in a house in Gengin. And even though Phoebe had moved out of her family home, she still kept in touch with her mom and siblings all the time. Regardless of living with a couple of people that she barely knew, Phoebe made the best of the situation and largely didn't seem bothered by the arrangement. But that sentiment would quickly change, because one day, in May of 2025, completely out of the blue, Phoebe disappeared, never to be seen again. Prior to her disappearance, Phoebe actually had plans to meet her boyfriend Levi in Western Australia. Phoebe was fond of traveling, and she wanted to explore more places outside of the rural town of Gengin. Phoebe even said in various social media posts that Gengin was a sad place and she didn't belong here. So she packed her bags for her flights from Bundaberg to Brisbane and then to Western Australia. Phoebe was last seen on the morning of May 15, 2025 at about 8:30 a.m. Security footage caught Phoebe carrying her luggage at Airport Drive in Bundaberg. She was wearing a green tank top and gray sweatpants. You would think that if she was so close to the airport that she would have made it. But when the Queensland police checked the flight records, Phoebe hadn't checked in for her flight to Western Australia, and she'd not been seen since. 17-year-old Phoebe was then reported missing on May 18th after she failed to answer her phone or reply to texts from her family. The detectives immediately launched an investigation for a missing person, and they decided to look into the details because, well, nothing made sense. This was all so sudden, and it was a relatively safe place, all things considered. So this whole situation was just bizarre. She was on her way to the airport. She was literally minutes away from that airport, but she never arrived at the terminal. She didn't check her luggage in, she didn't get her boarding pass. The investigators checked every single piece of security footage at that airport, just to see if they missed Phoebe by any chance, but there was no sign of her. So the Queensland police decided to backtrack a bit and look into the footage of Phoebe on Airport Drive. And that was when they uncovered more details. Phoebe was seen being driven in a gray Hyundai iX35. Now, this was the exact same type of car that Phoebe's housemates had, so it's assumed they must have been the ones driving her that day. So they decided to give them a visit and just ask some routine questions. But when they reached that house in Gengin, something was wrong. It was as if they walked into a pile of filth. This house did not look like a house, it looked like a makeshift garbage dump. To put it plainly, this place was barely even habitable. It was just gross. The front of the house was piled with trash, and it looked like it hadn't been picked up in weeks, if not maybe even months. Little did the investigators know, though, the inside of the house would be much worse and even more disgusting. Something was amiss, and the detectives had a very bad feeling about all of this. Upon knocking on the door to this disgusting house, the police were greeted by 34-year-old James Wood and 33-year-old Tanika Bromley, and they were pretty cooperative with the detectives, at least in the beginning. They told the investigators at around 8:30 a.m. Tanika and James had driven Phoebe to the airport, and when they were about 1 kilometer or so away from the actual terminal, Phoebe received a phone call from Levi, her boyfriend. According to James and Tanika, Phoebe and Levi got into a very heated argument, to the point where Phoebe was extremely shaken up and very edgy. So the couple decided to stop the car for a bit, and James and Tanika got out of the car to give Phoebe some space. James and Tanika claimed that after about 5 to 7 minutes, they returned to the car, but were stunned when they realized it was empty. Phoebe was gone, and so was her luggage. So James and Tanika assumed that Phoebe went to the airport by herself and caught her flight. They didn't bother to check up on her, to call her, or even make the short drive to the airport to see if she was okay. They just assumed that Phoebe had left, so they drove home. Now, this sounded as bizarre to the detectives as it probably does to you. I mean, sure, they weren't besties or something, they were just housemates, but Tanika and James were supposed to drop her off at the airport. The least they could do was just ensure Phoebe reached the terminal if they found the car deserted. Another thing the police deemed suspicious was the fact that Phoebe was never seen reaching the airport. If what James and Tanika were saying was true, then Phoebe should have been seen by airport security or people just walking around, or even caught on camera walking with her luggage in a cab. But she wasn't, which only made James and Tanika more suspicious in the eyes of the police. Moreover, the detectives were revolted as much as they were suspicious, because standing in that house, if you can even call it that, was impossible. Even the landlord said that the air tasted dirty. The scene inside that house was even more horrid. Piles upon piles of trash, ripped food packaging, and dog food were found all over the floor. It didn't look like the house had been cleaned since it was leased months ago. The bed sheets were stained yellow, and the floors were buried underneath piles of trash. The investigators also found some disturbing things. Chains, dog waste, and dog toys were found across the floors all over the home. According to the landlord, James and Tanika had leased the house just 6 months ago, and they pretty much turned the house into a dump of filth, which, if anyone calls a house that, you know it's bad, like really bad. Unsurprisingly, Tanika was given a notice to leave the house after a recent inspection. Even the landlord was confused and repulsed at the fact that this home was in such a bad state. He even questioned how the couple could breathe inside this home, let alone live in it. But as the detectives went outside, they spotted that same Hyundai iX35 that was seen on the Airport Drive security footage. But there was a problem. The license plate wasn't the same. The license plate could clearly be seen in the footage, and it was 414EW3. But now at the house, the car had a completely different number, and it was 474BW8. And this was weird. What was even more off-putting and heartbreaking was the fact that sometime before Phoebe's disappearance, James and Tanika's neighbors complained about a foul odor coming from the home. And when the police came to check, several deceased dogs were found on the property. It was concluded these dogs had died of natural causes inside the home, which is just insane. Neighbors had also complained about the racket of parties and barking and howling of dogs coming from that home all hours of the night that kept them on edge all the time. It was also eventually found out that Tanika and James were dating, but according to James's ex, she came forward and said that James told her that he and Tanika had split up and they were just living together. This whole situation just keeps getting more confusing by the second. But to make things even stranger, James also owned a bus, a big one, and it was parked out front of the home. He was in the process of trying to sell this bus, but according to James's ex, at this moment, he'd been living in the bus rather than in the home. And can you blame him? I mean, there's no way a home like that is safe to be in. Now, neighbors had seen Phoebe go in and out of the house, but they weren't aware that she lived with James and Tanika. I guess they just never saw the two come or go, so they assumed Phoebe was living alone in all this mess. So at this point, even though things were looking odd, the police really had no other evidence or anything incriminating to hold James and Tanika accountable for Phoebe's disappearance. And so the couple was free to go, and the investigation resumed. By May 23rd, 8 days into the search for Phoebe, the detectives searched various areas, and for some reason, they focused on Goodnight Scrub National Park. It was actually Phoebe's phone records that led them there. They had checked Phoebe's phone history, and even though Levi had called Phoebe on the morning of her flight to Western Australia, later when Phoebe had gone missing, it was revealed that that phone had been manually turned off. So the investigators deployed specialist police, including a dive squad, to Goodnight Scrub National Park, as they wanted to conduct land and waterway searches. After hours and hours of searching, police were able to find several pieces of evidence that proved that this park was, from the looks of it, the site of a gruesome crime. Several collections were made here, and evidence was sent in for forensic testing just to be sure, but it was clear from the get-go something dark took place here. While waiting for those forensic tests to come back, the detectives also came to a rather interesting conclusion. The Queensland police were certain that some of the evidence in Goodnight Scrub National Park had been moved before the detectives arrived for their search, and this was really bizarre. They also searched the vast areas with cadaver dogs in hopes of finding anything of value that would give them some sort of clue about where Phoebe may have gone. Well, before long, they found something that would certainly push the case forward, but it was not what they had hoped. While the search in the national park was on, James and Tanika had a run-in with the law. See, garbage, soiled waste, and inedible food weren't the only things in their Gin residence. The investigators had managed to find firearms and ammunition in the home as well as in the Hyundai iX35. So James and Tanika were ultimately arrested, but they were let out on bail. During this time, the search in the national park had expanded to its outskirts, and on June 6th, the detectives found something, but it would be anything but pleasant. See, on a back road surrounded by dense bushland near Goodnight Scrub National Park, the police discovered human remains. It looked like the remains had been tossed out without a care in the world, and no effort was made to hide the body. It wasn't even buried. When the detectives sent the remains for DNA testing, and the results came back on June 17th, everyone was shocked to the core. The remains were tragically identified as those of 17-year-old Phoebe Bishop, who'd gone missing just less than a month ago. Sure, the investigators had an inkling that the remains could have been Phoebe's, but no one is prepared for that confirmation. And it was such a devastating moment for the detectives as well as Phoebe's family. Since this is a developing case, Phoebe's exact cause of death hasn't been revealed yet. But if I'm being honest, does that really even matter? I know we all have a morbid curiosity about these kinds of things, but remember, this was a 17-year-old girl who was stolen from her family, from her friends, and from everyone who loved her. Her life was ripped from this earth for no good reason, and that is what's important. Well, the police already knew that something was suspicious, and they declared the messy and disgusting house, as well as the Hyundai iX35, as crime scenes. But now that Phoebe's body had been discovered, the case took a very dark turn. It was no longer an investigation to find Phoebe unharmed, it was now a matter of finding Phoebe's killers, and the police, as well as the general public, put their money on the very suspicious housemates, James Wood and Tanika Bromley. The most interesting part of this case is the fact that the suspects in Phoebe's disappearance were arrested before her body was even discovered. Tanika and James were arrested on the morning of June 5th, a day before Phoebe's remains were even found. Tanika was arrested first, and then James was taken into custody sometime later. The detectives also released body cam footage of James getting arrested, and he was wearing tracksuit pants and a shirt, and the detectives were seen telling an emotionless James that he was being arrested for Phoebe Bishop's homicide. Tanika and James were each charged with 1 count of homicide and 2 counts of interfering with a body. Following the couple's arrest, the case was taken to court, but the two decided not to appear for reasons that are unknown. I guess they didn't want to face the possible consequences of their actions, but we really don't know. They're probably going to prison regardless, and their failure to appear essentially secured their guilt, at least in my book. The thing is, since the case is still unfolding, police are obviously being pretty tight-lipped with this information. But that doesn't mean we've been completely left in the dark. In the most recent court hearing, more information about how Pheobe was attacked came out. The police believe that Pheobe was attacked in the same Hyundai iX35 right after she was seen on Airport Drive on May 15th. Although it's unclear exactly what happened to her, the detectives allege that Phoebe's body was moved twice after the crime was committed. Once after she was murdered, and then again about 2 days later, where it was eventually found on that back road near Goodnight Scrub National Park. The police also have evidence that Phoebe's phone was fully charged and online on the morning before the attack, but later it was manually turned off and it was never turned on again, suggesting her phone was most likely taken from her either before or during the attack. But there is one more thing. Remember the Hyundai car with the changed license plate? Well, it turned out the license plate wasn't the only thing that was changed. The Hyundai logo on the backside of the car was changed to that of a Toyota, but I'm not talking about a professional change such as a different emblem. This part was actually laughable because James and Tanika really thought they could fool the police. The Toyota logo was scribbled onto a strip of paper and then stuck to the back of the car where the Hyundai logo was. It looked like a preschooler did this. And the license plates were also not changed, not literally at least. Tanika and James didn't apply for a legit license plate change, nor did they steal one. The vehicle was still registered to the original license number 414EW3. But the couple had actually used electrical tape and black paint to turn the 1, E, and 3 into 7, B, and 8. Now, I don't know if these two were struggling with mental illness or if they really just were this bad at pulling off a crime, but this is darn near unbelievable. I mean, how many mental backflips did this couple have to come up with to get up with this bright idea? Like it was their master plan of throwing the detectives or the investigation off, but obviously it didn't work. There's no doubt in anyone's mind that Tanika and James are most likely responsible for and are behind Phoebe's murder. But the main question is, why? Well, James did talk to the Daily Mail and stated that Phoebe had a habit of bursting out in anger and had even smashed their TV at one point. During that interview, it was clear to see that this man had some serious resentment toward Phoebe. But remember, these are the words of a clearly, interesting man, as well as a possible murderer, so take all of this with a grain of salt. That TV thing may have never happened, and he could just certainly be lying. You've got to remember as well, James and Tanika are the ones with the house in disgusting condition and deceased animals all over their property. They're the ones with the unexplained possession of firearms and ammunition. They're also literal strangers to Phoebe, so no matter how you look at it, the housemates almost definitely likely had a hand in Phoebe's murder. Also, police claim that they have evidence that Phoebe's body had been moved twice, and they allegedly have evidence that James and Tanika were the ones who moved it. When you tack on the fact that James and Tanika's car was haphazardly disguised after they were spotted on CCTV, the whole paper logo and electrical tape license plate thing, well, I think we all know what happened here and who's responsible. It's also alleged that either the couple, or at least one of them, likely abused Phoebe, because several witnesses at a local store saw Phoebe come into the store a couple of days before her disappearance and eventual murder, and she looked weak and hungry, almost as if she'd been held against her will or something. But what's interesting about these accusations is that if Phoebe had been held against her will, well, she'd been speaking to her boyfriend in the days leading up to her passing, so why wouldn't she have mentioned this to him? My only guess is, if this did truly happen, maybe she was just that fearful of these people. And again, all of this is just assuming the eyewitness statements are proven to be accurate. But also, the whole situation between Phoebe and her family is kind of complicated. I mean, why was a 17-year-old girl living with practical strangers? It's reported that Phoebe had a complicated childhood in the sense that she never had a stable father figure. Her family was always moving, and she didn't stay in one school for too long because of these moves. But why didn't she live with her mother or some other family member? The whole situation is just bizarre, and I'm not sure why no one has bothered to clarify this. It just seems strange to me, but maybe I'm just looking too far into it. It could be as simple as she didn't get along with her mom, and being 17, she just wanted to try something new. But Phoebe's social media was also a very sad depiction of what she was going through. Her last TikTok video was about having a conversation with her younger self. She also mentioned her dad at one point, and how when she passes away, she wants her dad to help lower her coffin so that he can let her down one last time. Now, I get this was most likely some kind of dark humor, but there was clearly some truth to the pain in those words. Of course, we can't decode whatever Phoebe was feeling at that time, but she was obviously feeling, at a bare minimum, sad and down. Phoebe's mom, Kylie, was very emotional following her daughter's disappearance, and she just wanted answers. She was active on social media and on news stations, begging for any updates on Phoebe's case, so it's really hard to tell what's going on in Phoebe's personal life that led her to leave her home and live with strangers in a practical dump. Added to this is the whole discussion about Phoebe's mental health at the time of her disappearance. Even though Phoebe's aunt, Cass Johnson, questioned Phoebe's mental state and her work in the NDIS, Phoebe's mom, Kylie, blatantly denied all sorts of claims about her daughter's mental health and accused her own estranged sister of creating a circus by making comments without proof or evidence. She went into this massive tangent about how her sister was basically just being a pot stirrer and drumming up drama that was never really there. I personally can't really make heads or tails of this, but it seems painfully obvious that Phoebe's home life was most likely not pleasant. And this bit alone puts into perspective maybe why she wanted to move out and start on her own, albeit with some very strange roommates, but maybe that's all she could afford. In the end, all that matters is that Phoebe gets justice, and that's what everyone wants, whether they know Phoebe personally or not. Well, on June 30th, 2025, Phoebe's funeral was held, and she was laid to rest in Bundaberg. It was a private funeral, and friends and family gathered to say their final goodbyes. It was a very dark day for Phoebe's loved ones, but regardless, they wore brightly colored clothes to the assembly because they believed that's what Phoebe would have wanted. She loved everything vibrant and bright, and she really just wanted to be happy. She was cheerful, she loved to sing, dance, and hug people, and her loved ones wanted to remember her in that same way. I really hope that Phoebe's case reaches a conclusion soon. Hopefully as soon as next month based on the time of recording this video. We'll just have to see how things end up working out, but the next court hearing is supposed to take place in August. If there are any major updates, I'll do my best to touch base here and post them down in the comments, but I just hope that answers come out, the perpetrators get punished, and this grieving family can finally get some closure as to why and how their daughter's life was ripped away from her. A woman worked with her husband at a store that sold all types of spying equipment. It was a novelty store that sold gadgets and stuff you couldn't get anywhere else. But one day, completely out of nowhere, the woman walked to the back of the store and found a woman's lifeless body. If it wasn't for the dreadful pool that surrounded the body, the woman would have mistaken it for a mannequin. But as we all know, it's never a mannequin. The woman was naturally shaken up, but not just because she'd just discovered a crime scene, but because she'd seen the victim before, just hours ago, shopping around the store. Then, as the woman slowly backed away from the body, trying her hardest not to scream, she backed into something. Or someone. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If this is your first time here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts. I post new true crime documentaries every single week, so if that's your kind of thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date when I post new cases. Ginger Rios was born to parents Denise and George Rios in Hunt Ridge, Las Vegas. She had a sister named Daniela. Ginger was a vibrant young girl with big dreams. She wanted to become an entertainer, and according to her mom Denise, Ginger vowed to become Miss Las Vegas one day. Ginger, having grown up in Vegas, loved music, dancing, and singing, and she wanted to have her own show, or at least be in one. Ginger, aside from being incredibly talented, was also extroverted. She loved hanging out with people. She was the life of every party, and this girl just had an incredible amount of energy and charisma. When Ginger got older, she worked as a backup dancer in a performance group called the Salsa Machine. Then at the age of 20, she met 34-year-old Mark Hollinger. Now, they had quite a considerable age gap between them, but Ginger had a good head on her shoulders. Despite her young age, seeing how happy Mark made her, well, it caused her parents to accept him with open arms. They believed that Mark was the perfect person for Ginger. He was the yin to her yang. Complete opposites, but they still complemented each other effortlessly. Mark and Ginger soon got married, and they moved into a home shortly before the events of today's case. Now, the couple was originally renting a home, but the option of buying that home was on the table by leasing it. But for that, Ginger and Mark needed a good credit score. The couple thought that buying a house would be better for their future, in case they had kids and their family grew. So they were really serious about buying this house, to the point where Ginger wanted to go to a local shop in Las Vegas and buy a book on how to improve their credit score. Mind you, this was 1997. It wasn't quite as simple as just Googling it like it is today. So that's exactly what the couple did on April 4th, 1997. Ginger and Mark drove to 3507 Maryland Parkway, but on the way there, they spotted a very unique store called Spycraft. It was a strange little store. They sold a variety of equipment like surveillance cameras and spying gadgets, listening devices, books on a variety of topics, and even trackers. Spycraft was well known at the time as it was a chain store with a bunch of branches in the West. Anyway, Mark sat in the car while Ginger hopped out and entered the store. It wasn't meant to be a long trip or anything. Ginger just wanted to pop in, take a look around, and then come right back out. She had her wallet with her, and the rest of her belongings were still in the car. For Spycraft, their usual clientele was quite diverse. Some people came in looking for trackers to keep an eye on their kids, while some had more questionable backgrounds and wanted to get their hands on shady devices without getting into trouble. The specific store was run by a man named John Flowers and his wife, Cheryl. Now, Ginger walked inside the store, expecting to only be there for a minute or two, but after several minutes passed by, she just never came out. Mark was right there in the parking lot, but he never saw Ginger emerge from the store. If Ginger had gone somewhere else, surely Mark would have seen her and gone after her, but Ginger never came out of the storefront. A few minutes later, Mark had had enough, and Ginger's unusual delay was getting to him. They had other things to do, so he was naturally a little bit annoyed. So he went inside the store and made a beeline for the cash register, where John and his wife Cheryl were tending to customers. Mark proceeded to describe Ginger to the couple and asked them if she was still inside the store and what was taking her so long. The store owner's answer left Mark dumbfounded. John told Mark that Ginger had purchased a book and already left quite some time ago, but Mark knew that that wasn't true. He was right outside, and even though he couldn't see exactly inside the store, he could clearly see who left and who entered. So after this bombshell was dropped, Mark went around the store and searched aisle after aisle, hoping to find Ginger, but she wasn't there. Mark again made his way to the store owners and pleaded with them to tell him where his wife was, but John said the same thing, leaving Mark more confused than ever. So with no choice, Mark left the store and called his father-in-law, Ginger's dad, George, telling him that Ginger had just disappeared. George, not thinking too much of it, assured Mark that she might have gone to a nearby store and maybe Mark just didn't notice her leaving. But after hours had gone by and there was still no sign of Ginger, that was when her dad also began to worry. This was totally unlike her. She would never leave just like that. And remember, aside from her wallet, which didn't even have a lot of cash in it, her purse was still with Mark in the car, so she couldn't have just run away on a whim. Something must have happened to her, and by now both George and Mark feared that they may have to report Ginger as a missing person. But they could never have guessed that in just a few short hours, Ginger would be found, just not the way they had hoped. All of George and Mark's doubts led them back to Spycraft later that night. They wanted to see the surveillance footage of Ginger to try to track her movements and see where she had gone. But when Mark and George arrived at the store, it was closed, and John and Cheryl were standing outside near a van, and there was a baby in Cheryl's arms, her and John's baby. Mark and George approached the couple and requested to just see the footage, but John said that they were in a rush, but that the two men could come back after the weekend to see the footage. And just like that, the couple, Mark and George, parted ways. But Ginger's disappearance nagged at them like a shadow that wouldn't leave them alone. By the following Monday, Ginger had officially been reported missing to the police. The detectives found Ginger's disappearance very odd, and even though at first they thought maybe Ginger was a runaway, that theory soon died down when Ginger's bank accounts were checked. Nothing had been spent, and the money was just sitting there untouched. If Ginger had run away, she would probably need money, since she didn't have a lot on her the day that she was last seen. So the police started to make a list of suspects, and Mark, naturally, was at the top of their list. They wanted to rule Mark out as a suspect, since the first people the police look into are usually spouses and family members. Well, investigators had a good reason to look into Mark, because they uncovered something. Ginger and Mark's marriage was on the rocks. It was revealed that Ginger had spent some days at a hotel to distance herself from Mark, possibly following an argument. It was also odd to the investigators that Mark didn't call the police right away and instead called his father-in-law. If Mark was that worried about Ginger, you'd think he would have just reported her missing right away, but he didn't. Worse yet, a bizarre incident occurred just days after Ginger's disappearance. Mark's car suspiciously caught fire and was burnt to a crisp. This was really bizarre for the police to hear. The police were now adamant that Mark was hiding something, and that the car burning on its own was anything but accidental. Investigators firmly believed that Mark tried to destroy evidence by lighting the car on fire. To add to the suspicion, Mark was also MIA following this incident. Well, once Mark was found, not too long after, he was ruthlessly investigated by the police. But he stood his ground. He claimed he had nothing to do with Ginger's disappearance, and he was just as worried about her as everyone else. But speaking about the car accident, Mark explained that on his way back home, his car overheated and caught fire, which caused Mark to exit the car and just get away from the flames. At that point, the fire was out of control, and Mark was unable to extinguish it since he was in the middle of the road with no help. So he just left it there and went back home on foot. Remember, cell phones weren't really commonplace at this point yet, so it's not like he could have just called 911 unless he found a payphone. So giving up and going home, while not the best choice, wouldn't have really been that big of a red flag as we may see it these days. But the burned car was taken in as evidence and was tested from top to bottom for anything incriminating, but the police didn't find anything. Either because the fire had destroyed everything, or maybe Mark really had nothing to do with Ginger's disappearance at all, and all this was just a bad coincidence. So the police found nothing on Mark, and he was naturally free to go. But still, days passed and there was no sign of Ginger, and it was safe to say the police's minds were going to some disturbing places. After striking Mark off the suspect list, the next thing for the police to do was to go to Spycraft, the place where Ginger was last seen. They wanted to look at the surveillance footage, but to their surprise and annoyance, the store owner John was in Phoenix, Arizona at the time managing his other store, so without him the police couldn't really access the tapes. Well, they still decided to look around, and when they walked to the back of the store where the bathroom was, they were hit with that unmistakable, pungent odor of bleach. Eerily, there was also a single but very small stain on the bathroom wall, and the police collected the sample and were waiting on John for an explanation. Ginger was missing. She was last seen inside the very store they were standing in, and now there's a very strong smell of bleach and a questionable stain on the wall. What are the odds? Well, the police got a hold of John and inquired about the bleach and the stain. John was quick to come to his own defense, and he claimed that his pet dog had dirtied up the bathroom, and he had to use the bleach to get rid of the awful smell. He further explained that the stain on the wall belonged to the dog too. Well, the police couldn't do much about the stain because it was too small to be tested. To be fair, it was also 1997, so DNA technology was nowhere near as advanced and meticulous as it is today. Well, the police further asked John about Ginger, but he told the police exactly what he had told Mark. Ginger came into the store, bought the books she needed, paid, and left. John also claimed to have surveillance footage and Ginger's purchase receipts, but when the investigators asked John to provide them with those two things, he couldn't for some reason. He was either lying or he'd not kept a record of the store footage or the receipts. Either way, it wasn't a good look. Even though the police were not convinced and they sensed that something was amiss, they really couldn't do anything. There just wasn't any evidence. I mean, literally nothing. The police then looked into Ginger's career as a performer. The police had a theory that Ginger might have a stalker and that she'd been targeted by someone random and deranged. But when the detectives looked further into this theory, nothing came of it. And just like that, a month passed and there was no progress in Ginger's case. No one had any leads, any information, or anything useful that could lead the investigators in the right direction. and things weren't looking good. Well, that would soon change when several months later, someone would come forward with incriminating information about Ginger's disappearance, and this would finally lead to some answers about the missing woman. The person who came forward was a woman by the name of Cheryl. Now that name should ring a bell. She was John Flowers' wife, well, ex-wife. The couple had since been divorced, and Cheryl came to the police with information that could help solve Ginger's cold case. When the police asked why she didn't come forward with this information months ago, she claimed that she was scared of her husband and wasn't sure how he would react, since she was the one who discovered Ginger. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. According to Cheryl, as soon as Ginger walked into the store, John was burning holes in the back of Ginger's head with his creepy, longing eyes. He then told Cheryl to grab something from the back, which wasn't unusual, as John barked orders at everyone all the time. And after a couple minutes, when Cheryl came back, Ginger was nowhere to be seen. Cheryl assumed that Ginger had purchased her things and left, but that would be far from the truth. Now, when a worried Mark entered the store and inquired about his wife, Cheryl honestly didn't know where Ginger was. But after Mark left, an uneasy John warned Cheryl not to go into the back storage room. Now, Cheryl was already on edge, but she went into the back of the store anyway, despite her nerves jumping up and down, fearful at the thought of getting caught by John. When she opened the door, she barely bit back a scream as she saw a lifeless Ginger on the floor. As Cheryl was backing away, she bumped into none other than John. It was literally a scene out of a horror movie. Can you imagine how scared Cheryl must have been at that exact moment? John then cornered Cheryl and warned her to never breathe a word about what she saw in front of anyone, or else she and her baby wouldn't like the consequences. According to Cheryl, John told her what he had done to Ginger. When Cheryl left to get what John wanted, John immediately subdued Ginger from behind and attacked her savagely, until tragically she had lost her life. But John didn't tell Cheryl why he attacked Ginger, which is even more mind-boggling. Can you imagine how Ginger must have been feeling getting fatally attacked in a store from behind by a stranger? It is chilling. Cheryl also remembered John cleaning up the back room with tons of bleach alongside another employee. And afterward, he loaded Ginger's body in a van. The same van by which the couple stood and talked to Mark and George when they came looking for Ginger later that evening after she'd gone missing. Mark and George were mere feet away from Ginger's lifeless body. And to make matters worse, Cheryl knew where Mark's wife was, but she couldn't dare open her mouth in front of her husband. Cheryl told the police that she, John, and their baby drove to Arizona, and John encased Ginger's body in a concrete grave, which he then buried in the desert. Coincidentally, a month after Ginger's disappearance, the police did find an unidentified body in the desert, but it was later revealed to not be Ginger. But when John caught wind of this, he left Cheryl and went on the run. It was actually Cheryl who led the investigators to the place where Ginger's body was buried. And sure enough, under sand, there was concrete, and encased in that concrete were human remains. When the remains were recovered, they were tested and were ultimately identified as 20-year-old Ginger Rios. With Ginger's body now found, the police could finally get a search warrant for the Spycraft store. And when they searched the place, Ginger's DNA was found in the back room. The police knew that they had their guy, but there was one problem. John Flowers was on the run, and to everyone's surprise, John wasn't even his real name. His real name was Craig Leslie Jacobson, and boy did he have a laundry list of crimes behind him. So Craig, aka John, was actually a fugitive. He was wanted for burglary and fraud, and he fled to Florida to avoid getting caught. Afterward, Craig changed his name to John Flowers, married Cheryl, who I'm not sure was aware of Craig's seedy past or not, and then opened up 4 Spycraft stores in the West, including the one in the Las Vegas strip mall. Several people came forward and accused Craig of targeting dark-haired women, and a young man even claimed that Craig paid him to take pictures of dark-haired women, which is just disturbing. Craig was soon arrested in LA in August of 1997 after he got into a physical altercation with a police officer, but we don't really know what that was even about. But I guess Craig or John or whoever he wasn't even good at keeping a low profile, because he was soon extradited to Nevada and charged with Ginger's murder, and he confessed to taking Ginger's life. Craig claimed that he suffered from schizophrenia and was also paranoid, but this could have just been his plan of getting a lower sentence all along. See, a psychologist came forward and said that Craig had told people in prison that he would, quote, plead insanity and act crazy to get off lightly. The prosecution stressed that Craig was mentally fit to stand trial and that he was, in fact, faking his mental illness. The prosecution was planning on going for the death penalty, but they offered a plea deal to Craig, which he quickly accepted. Craig, as part of the plea deal, pled guilty to Ginger's murder and would pay her family approximately $3,200 in restitution, as well as spend life in prison with parole after 20 years. And this was exactly what Craig received in the end. But there was more. Remember the unidentified body that was found just less than a mile away from Ginger's body in the desert? Well, it took the police several years to identify the victim, but it was also a young girl, and she was named Christina Martinez. She was 15 at the time she passed away, and it's believed that Craig was behind her attack as well. Christina had gone missing after going to a local laundromat on May 3rd, 1997, and she lived in a group home that was coincidentally right across the street from the Spycraft store in Arizona. Tragically, since Christina had a turbulent past and a history of running away before, no one reported her missing, which is just heartbreaking. This girl was out there, buried in the desert for months on end, and no one was even looking for her. But in 2015, Craig was released from prison in Nevada, and he was extradited to Arizona to then be tried for Christina's murder. But he hasn't been sentenced for her murder as of present. In 2016, he was deemed incompetent to stand trial by a Maricopa County Superior Court judge. But later, that same judge ruled that he was indeed competent and that he was faking mental illness. Well, on September 21st of 2017, Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Warren Granville granted a defense motion for the evaluation of Craig's competency to stand trial for Christina's murder. But there haven't been any updates so far, at least none that have been announced publicly. We only know that Craig is still in prison and that he's taken the lives of more young girls and women than he's letting on, including another young girl named Mary Stoddard in May of '97, and her body hasn't even been found yet. Ginger's passing was quite the blow to her family. Craig sent apology letters to Ginger's dad from behind prison walls, saying that he was sorry for what he made the family go through. Craig confessed that he attached Ginger because she apparently had snapped at him in the store. Now, I'm sure dealing with difficult customers is not what any store worker wants to do, but do others just go around murdering people? No. And I'm not even sure if what Craig was saying is true. He is a sick human who targets young girls and women, and he's a serial killer, for crying out loud. He doesn't have a leg to stand on, and it can only be assumed that nearly everything he says, well, it's most likely a lie. Mark, who was initially suspected of Ginger's disappearance, was very emotional and distraught in televised interviews. He just wanted his wife back. They were on the brink of starting their lives together, and sure, their life wasn't perfect, but he adored Ginger and all that she was. Tragically, Ginger's mom, Denise, lost her life to cancer on July 24th of 2014. George and his remaining daughter, Daniela, were both naturally torn up by losing Denise as well, but they say that the one bit of peace they found was understanding that, at this point, at least Ginger and Denise are both together in a land beyond. Ginger had so much to look forward to in her life. She wanted to own a house with her husband, have kids, and watch them grow up, but she didn't get to do anything she planned. She didn't get to have her own performance show, she didn't get to make her debut as a dancer or a singer because now she was just a memory in the hearts of her loved ones, who still go through unimaginable grief when they think of how their lives changed forever that fateful day in April of 1997. They won't find anything unless they move the concrete. This phrase sent police into a frenzy. As they spent hours upon hours digging up grass, dirt, and animal bones, they finally found what they were dreading: human remains. Dental records confirmed that these remains belonged to Zoe Campos, but piecing together what happened to her, that was a different task entirely. How is it that an ordinary day with friends could have ended so badly? Well, it turns out you can't trust anyone, and certainly not your friends. Welcome to True Crime Stories. I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're interested in simple, classic true crime, then you've come to the right place, because that's pretty much all we do here. So be sure to subscribe. It's completely free and it just keeps you up to date with my future videos. Zoe Campos was born on September 4th of 1995 and was the youngest of 3 siblings. Her dad, Alejandro, was in the Marines, so because of this, the Campos family traveled a lot. Right after Zoe was born, the family would bounce from place to place, from Honolulu, Hawaii, to Round Rock, Texas, and even San Diego, California. Before long, the Campos family made it to Lubbock, Texas, which was their permanent home. And this was also the time when Zoe's parents, unfortunately, went their separate ways, and Zoe dealt with all the emotion and trauma that comes along with a major family shift like this. Zoe, even as a young girl, had a huge heart, and she just wanted to help all the animals out there, which is why she'd often bring home stray animals and insist that her family help nurse them back to health and give them a home. This seems to have been a recurring theme for her, and her mom recalls multiple times when Zoe would just show up with a new animal to care for. Zoe, by the time she turned 18, was extremely responsible. She didn't get into trouble, she wasn't a party child, and she was on her way to do great things. She had multiple dreams that she was considering pursuing. Obviously, she wanted to help animals, but she also had a pretty serious interest in the automotive world too, and was considering becoming something along the lines of a mechanic. But one night in November of 2013 would end all of these dreams in the blink of an eye. Because after a night out with friends, Zoe would never come home. November 17th of 2013 was a busy day for Zoe. She spent the day at home, but as evening rolled around, she actually had plans of visiting her friend, April, who had just given birth. Now, we all know that Zoe loved children, animals, and babies, so she was not going to miss out on this. April had invited some of her other friends too, and it was more like a little gathering at her house for everyone to meet the newest addition of her family. So Zoe left April's house at 9 p.m., but she still had other plans after that. She met up with her sister Savannah and the kids for dinner, and after that, they were going to rent a movie and spend the night at Savannah's. This was Zoe's definition of a perfect night. Meeting an adorable baby, coming back home to her sister and her kids, having dinner with them, watching a movie, maybe having a late night snack, and then calling it a night. Life couldn't get any better for Zoe, but it would end in tragedy. After the movie ended, all of them went to bed, and Zoe was going to sleep on the couch. The next morning, on November 18th, Savannah came out of her bedroom ready for work when she noticed that Zoe was nowhere to be seen. Now, this was slightly alarming for Savannah, because Zoe wasn't the type of person to just up and leave without telling anyone. So Savannah did the first thing that came to her mind, and she called Zoe, but she wasn't picking up her phone. When Savannah looked out the window, she noticed that Zoe's car was gone, so she figured that maybe Zoe left it in the middle of the night for some reason. The next thing Savannah did was call her mom, Melinda, who was working at a local bar the night before. Now, this was when Savannah got to know about a strange event that confirmed that Zoe had indeed left the house the night before. See, Melinda was working her shift when, at around 2:30 a.m., she received a message from none other than Zoe. It was a bit unusual, but it wasn't anything alarming. Zoe just asked her mom if she needed a ride home. Now, for some context, Melinda's car was at a repair shop, so she was actually grateful that Zoe was coming to pick her up. But the thing is, Zoe never came. Melinda waited for her daughter outside the bar for almost 30 minutes and kept calling her, but there was no answer. Melinda wasn't too worried, because she thought that maybe Zoe had just fallen asleep, so Melinda made the short walk to her friend's house and spent the night there. But when she got the call from Savannah and she realized that no one had heard from Zoe, that was when both women started to get anxious. They called everywhere, Zoe's friends, local hospitals, but no one had seen or heard from Zoe. That was when Melinda and Savannah called the police at around 5 p.m. But the detectives were in no hurry to make a missing person report. They pulled the classic police maneuver and said that Zoe may have run away and was just blowing off steam somewhere. The detectives wanted to wait 24 hours before they officially reported her missing, which is unacceptable no matter the circumstances. Melinda and Savannah tried to reason with the investigators and stressed that Zoe would never just leave like that. She had no reason to. But did the detectives listen? Well, of course not. They did exactly what they said, and they refused to list her as a missing person until the following day. But then they later put out an APB for Zoe's Lincoln Town car. They didn't have to wait long, though, because Zoe's aunt, Monica, saw her car on the road the following day. Now, since the windows were tinted, she couldn't make out the driver's face, but she knew for sure that it wasn't Zoe. According to Monica, it looked like a 20-something-year-old male was wearing a hoodie and driving her car. She and her son followed the car but ended up losing sight of it when it made a turn, and then it was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, the car was found abandoned at Driftwood Apartments, which just so happened to be the apartments where Zoe was living. Monica called the police and notified them of this discovery, and when the detectives got there, they searched the car, but there was no sign of Zoe. This was equal parts dreadful and relieving for Monica, because she'd been tailing this car, fearing that Zoe may have somehow been trapped inside the car by the driver. But reality still haunted everyone. Zoe was nowhere, and she just vanished without a trace. But what the investigators did find in the car was duct tape, Zoe's black jacket, an unknown sweatshirt that probably belonged to the man, and a phone charger. All of this was taken, and the clothes were sent for forensic testing. In the meantime, the detectives also went through Zoe's phone records, and even though they couldn't find the exact location where her phone was, they could pinpoint the last known activity on her phone, and it was near a place called Lowry Field. Now, what you should know about Lowry Field is that it is not a safe place. It is sketchy at best. There's a lot of criminal dealings and adult work in the area, so imagine the surprise of Zoe's family when they found out that her last known location was near this area. Now, considering Zoe was about as clean-cut as it gets, she most definitely wasn't involved in adult work or any other type of crime for that matter. So why would she be here of all places? Was she kidnapped? Did someone lure her there? And was she even still alive? As the police were trying to figure things out, they wanted to talk to all of the people in Zoe's life. The first person of interest was Zoe's ex-boyfriend, Joe. He and Zoe dated for a long time before mutually calling it quits. There was no bad blood between them, and Joe was genuinely worried for Zoe and where she could be. And also, Joe had an airtight alibi the night that Zoe went missing. The next person was another young man named Jacob. Zoe had also dated him for a while before finding out that he cheated on her, which resulted in them breaking up. Even though Jacob and Zoe were in contact in the days leading up to her disappearance, he also had a pretty solid alibi for the night. And even though he was your typical bad boy who always got into trouble, there was no evidence that could convince the detectives that Jacob had anything to do with Zoe's disappearance. The next person on the radar was a guy named Ben. Interestingly enough, Ben was someone Melinda dated. So why was he getting questioned by the police? Well, from Zoe's phone records, it showed that Zoe made a call to none other than Ben the night that she went missing. But why? The investigators called him in for questioning and a polygraph test, but they hit a dead end yet again because Ben also had a solid alibi, and he also didn't seem dodgy or closed off during the investigation. If anything, he was just as worried as everyone else. So the detectives were back to square one. But there was one more thing they had to look into, and that was April's hangout that Zoe went to. They wanted to speak to anyone and everyone at the party. Maybe there was someone who'd seen Zoe with another person. Maybe they could provide more details as to how Zoe was behaving before she disappeared. If she was scared, if she was her normal self, all the basic questions. So that was when everyone from the party was questioned, and one of them was Carlos Rodriguez. He was initially questioned by the police on November 25th, and he gave his version of events. Carlos was a friend of a friend who basically knew Zoe through a mutual friend, and they didn't really know each other very well personally, but they were friends with one another for sure. Carlos also said that he and Zoe left around the same time, and he didn't know what happened from that moment onwards. Now, you may think that this was another dead end, and the detectives were just wasting their time looking in the wrong direction. Carlos didn't really know Zoe, so he couldn't possibly know what happened to her, right? Well, something about Carlos and his story didn't sit right with the police. They couldn't do anything about it because they lacked evidence, but they decided to keep tabs on this guy just in case. 2 weeks later, on December 9th, Carlos was called back to the police station for another interview. And this time in a sworn statement, Carlos' story changed completely. Carlos went on to admit that what he said on November 25th was a complete lie. Carlos did in fact meet Zoe afterward, but not in the way you think. They added each other on Facebook and then chatted there. Carlos invited Zoe over to his house where they would smoke illegal substances. Now, Carlos admitted that he wanted to be friends with Zoe, or something more, and he just wanted to have a good time with her. He said that Zoe did come over that night, but Carlos didn't have any illegal substances on him. So Zoe left to get some for them, but she never came back. Now, this was bizarre. First of all, and I know I sound like a broken record, but Zoe didn't dabble in illegal substances, so how would she know where to find them at the most ungodly hour of the night? Second, even though Carlos swore up and down that he had nothing to do with Zoe's disappearance, even though he was technically the last person to be with her, this was classic suspect behavior, and the detectives knew that. If that wasn't suspicious enough, can you take a guess where Carlos's house was? Well, if you said Lowry Field, then you'd be absolutely right. If you remember, Zoe's last known location was within 1 mile of Lowry Field. But it wasn't going to be easy for the investigators to convict Carlos of whatever he did to Zoe, because there was no physical evidence that could tie him to her disappearance. So the detectives had to question Carlos again and again, in hopes that maybe he would slip up and give more details. In the meantime, Carlos's house was also searched by the police, but since Carlos had recently moved out, a lot of things had changed, and finding evidence was getting harder and harder. But do you remember the male sweatshirt that was found in Zoe's car? Well, it turned out that belonged to Carlos. And get this, forensic tests confirmed that DNA found on that jacket belonged to Zoe. So Carlos couldn't deny it any longer. He was with Zoe the night she disappeared. But as much as I hate to say this, the investigation for Zoe's disappearance went on for years after this. Zoe disappeared in November of 2013, and now it was nearing a little over 4 years later when Carlos was questioned for the upteenth time. But this time around, the interview was held at the Lubbock County Correctional Center. Now, why, you ask? Well, it turns out that Carlos was now serving a sentence there. He was charged with stalking an ex-girlfriend of his, so you can already guess what a guy Carlos was by this point. It also turns out for 4 years, this guy withheld information about Zoe when the police were certain that he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't until July of 2018 when an inmate from the same correctional center where Carlos was came to the detectives with some very disturbing information. He said that during a conversation with Carlos about his home getting searched, Carlos flat out said, quote, they wouldn't find anything until they moved the concrete. This was the biggest lead in Zoe's case so far, and the investigators immediately went to Carlos's former home to do exactly what they had to do, move the concrete. With the help of cadaver dogs, the detectives honed in on a particular area in the backyard, presumably an area that had been covered by concrete. But oddly enough, the police never actually mentioned finding any concrete. But soon enough, when they dug around, they came across some bones. They were horrified by this discovery. Without wasting any time, the police sent the remains for testing, but the results were not what they expected. The remains were not human. They were animal remains. This was very depressing and anticlimactic for the police. They get one lead from this uncooperative person, and even that goes nowhere. But the detectives decided to play a little game with Carlos. Now sure, the remains weren't Zoe's, but the investigators were certain that they just needed to find the right place to look for them. So the investigators revisited Carlos again and started again asking some questions. During the questioning, the detectives casually brought up the bones found in his backyard, hoping to get a reaction out of him. Luckily, they did. It was like the police could see Carlos shutting down right in front of them. He was panicking, but he calmly asked for an attorney, and he said he wouldn't be cooperating with the detectives anymore, as if he ever cooperated in the first place. But this reaction was all the investigators needed. The interesting thing is that even the detectives didn't know that the bones were animal remains at this point, because the test results hadn't come back by then. Yet they still poked Carlos for more information with this tactic. It was a pretty smart move. They knew for sure that Carlos had done something terrible to Zoe, and as much as they were horrified to think about it, they now knew that Carlos's backyard hid more than just animal bones. 5 years after Zoe's disappearance, Carlos was finally ready to confess. In his mind, the police had already found Zoe's remains, and the detectives let him think that. So this is what happened to Zoe the night before she tragically lost her life. We already know by now that Zoe and Carlos agreed to meet up at his house. Some sources also said that once they got to his house, things got intimate between the two. But what actually happened next was that they smoked cigarettes that had been laced with a highly illegal substance. Now, I'm not sure whether Zoe knew that these cigarettes contained this substance, if she was forced to do them, or if she did it of her own free will, we just don't know. But let me just say, what these cigarettes were laced with was an incredibly psychoactive chemical. This wasn't the typical stuff that you can buy variations of at a local gas station. This was the kind of stuff that'll send you straight to another planet, causing intense hallucinations and a complete loss of your grip on reality. Carlos confessed that after smoking, he turned to look at Zoe, but he didn't see her sitting in front of him. Rather, he saw a demon, and this terrified him. As a result, he struck Zoe with all of his might before taking her life with his bare hands. Once he knew that Zoe was no longer alive, Carlos dug a shallow grave in his backyard and buried Zoe's body. I guess after he came down from the high, he realized what he had done. Because what was interesting was that a couple months later, Carlos actually dug Zoe back up and buried her deeper in the backyard so that no one would find her. So Carlos hallucinated and saw Zoe morphing into a demon, or so he says. But he was coherent enough to bury her in his backyard right afterward? That's the part that doesn't add up. If he was as far gone as he claims to be, this man wouldn't have been able to even lift a shovel, let alone dig a grave. Now don't get me wrong, some hardcore substances can cause wild hallucinations, but it's just so infuriating to think that Carlos, instead of snapping out of his haze or asking for help, thought that the most reasonable option would be to end Zoe's life, then just cover everything up. It's just so unbelievable, but I guess in his mind, everything was going to be fine because he was never going to get caught. But he would never have guessed how wrong he truly was. Carlos was taken to the backyard of his former home, and after pointing out the exact location and digging, on November 16th of 2018, the detectives found another set of remains. And unfortunately this time, they weren't animal remains. Dental records confirmed that the remains did indeed belong to 18-year-old Zoe Campos. Carlos was immediately arrested and charged with Zoe's murder. Carlos, the master of dragging things out for impossibly long periods, pleaded not guilty, so now he was awaiting trial behind bars. In the meantime, he wrote a letter to the media, basically confirming the fact that he ended Zoe's life, and his letter was filled with details on what he did to Zoe and how sorry he was for what he did. Infuriatingly, Carlos went ahead and said that the guilt of keeping this a secret was weighing on him. Yet he continued to keep his little secret, and to top this off, he still pleaded not guilty. That's the part that really blows my mind. He all but confessed to the crime in the media, yet in court still claimed he was innocent. It doesn't even make sense. But hold on, because this next bit will make your blood boil even more. Carlos went on to address the Campos family and apologize to them for their loss. But still, Carlos stressed that he is not a murderer and that it was the hallucinations that made him do this in the first place. But Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but you made a choice to smoke the substance, knowing full well what it was capable of. In my book, that makes you fully responsible for whatever happens after the fact. But all this aside, he begged the Campos family to forgive him and not seek revenge. His exact words were, quote, "Just remember, don't seek revenge, seek justice. Don't hate your enemies, love and forgive them." I am truly, honestly, at a complete loss of words. But let's just get back to the trial, because this nuisance deserves to suffer behind bars for what he did to Zoe. The trial was held in 2022, and the jury wasted no time in coming to a decision. 29-year-old Carlos Rodriguez was found guilty of murdering Zoe Campos, and he was sentenced to life in prison. It only took the jury 14 minutes to determine the sentence. 14 minutes. That's how guilty this man was. Zoe's family felt like they were hit by a tidal wave when they found out that the investigators had recovered her remains. Her mom and sister were so devastated by what happened to Zoe. To not see or hear from your child for more than 5 years, living in this pit of uncertainty and dealing with leads that were more and more horrific as they went, these 5 years have been brutal for Zoe's family. The only silver lining is that they got to bring Zoe home and lay her to rest peacefully. Zoe's funeral was held on December 4th of 2018, and everyone said their final goodbyes to a young woman who would have been a pet lover, a dang good mechanic, and a source of joy for everyone. Zoe's mom, Melinda, misses her daughter's warm smile and voice terribly. Melinda said that planning her daughter's funeral was the hardest, most heartbreaking thing in her life, and she prays that no parent ever goes through this. We can only hope that the Campos family finds peace after this tremendous loss, because there are literally no words to describe how awful this case was. Illegal substances are bad enough, and they can ruin lives in every sense of the word. Even if Carlos initially had no intentions of harming Zoe, it's just another glaring example of why drugs are so incredibly catastrophic, and how losing yourself in them will only lead to heartache, one way or the other. It was a cold December day in 2017 when Mandy Stavik heard a knock on her door. It was her 81st birthday, but she didn't feel like celebrating. In fact, she hadn't felt like celebrating at all in the last 28 years. Well, at least not since her teenage daughter, Mandy, was found murdered in November of 1989. When 81-year-old Mary opened the door, she was greeted by a police officer. This sight alone was triggering for her, as she'd been greeted similarly by an officer when her daughter's body was found, discarded like trash, all those years ago. But this time, the officer wasn't delivering terrible news. Instead, he had just 3 words to say. And no, it wasn't, "Happy birthday, Mary." No, it was 3 words she'd waited 30 years to hear. "We got him." Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. There's no overblown drama, no AI voiceovers, just classic true crime. So if that's your thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. Amanda Stavik, better known by her nickname of Mandy, was born in Anchorage, Alaska. Mandy was a combination of athletic and smart. She was a cheerleader at Mount Baker High School, and all of her teachers loved her. Mandy participated in track as well as baseball, too. After high school, she enrolled in Central Washington University, and she loved it there. She was the type of person who would help anyone and everyone. Mandy's mom, Mary, defined her as a go-getter. She wanted to try everything, and she wanted to be the best at everything she did. At the time of the case, Mandy, a freshman in college, was at Holm in Acme, Washington, a small rural community in Whatcom County, and she was there for Thanksgiving. Her family got together for the holidays every year so that they could catch up and share stories about what they'd been up to since their last Thanksgiving. A pretty typical tradition for many of us, I guess. Well, the day after, when everyone had already either left or begun loading up to head back home, Mandy decided it was time to get back to business as usual, and she hopped right back into her daily routine. It was November 24th, 1989, when 18-year-old Mandy went out for a jog in her neighborhood. Mandy loved jogging and running, and she was usually accompanied by her dog, a German Shepherd named Kyra, and this was a time that they both looked forward to almost every single day. Mandy was seen by a few people, including a man in a pickup truck, who saw her running down the road with Kyra. The road was relatively safe, and as you normally hear in a lot of these cases, crime was a rarity. It was 1989. People didn't have security cameras, and the concept of even locking their doors was foreign to them. Mandy jogged down this same path many times, but just because nothing bad had happened before doesn't mean that it won't ever happen. And sadly, this jog would be Mandy's last, because after several hours had passed by, Mandy's parents realized something. Mandy never made it home. This was extremely alarming for Mandy's family. Mandy was usually always on time, with Kyra accompanying her. It wasn't like she had plans out of the blue and took Kyra with her. Besides, she was in her running clothes. Surely she would have come back home to change into something more appropriate if she planned on meeting someone. Mandy would always tell her parents if she was going anywhere. But hours had passed by, and there was no sign of Mandy. That was when Mandy's family and loved ones began panicking. This was totally unlike her, and they needed to find her before it was too late. While Mandy's friends and family were out looking for her, they saw something off in the distance. Now, they weren't quite sure what it was at first, but as they drew nearer, they realized what they had found. A German Shepherd was prancing its way back home. It was Kyra, but she was alone. This was not a good sign. Why would Kyra come back home alone? And where was Mandy? The poor dog was dehydrated and tired, and it was clear that something bad had happened. Kyra was very edgy and very nervous looking, and so were Mandy's loved ones. That was the moment when the detectives got involved, and 18-year-old Mandy Stavik was finally reported missing. Mandy's search was huge and sensational. No one thought that something bad could happen in the quiet, quaint town of Acme. but it did, and now the whole community was shaken up. Girls and women were scared of walking the streets even in broad daylight. Parents were worried sick for their kids, and even watching them leave for school or to play with their friends down the street made them uneasy. The detectives got to work right away. Mandy was definitely not a runaway. She went out for a jog. She was in her running clothes and pink shoes. Her belongings, cash, and everything important were still at home, so she wouldn't have run away unprepared. So the police decided to search the route that Mandy normally took. It was a regular road, but it had patches of thickly wooded areas off in the distance. It was quite remote, like you wouldn't see people or cars for miles, but it was pretty normal for a small community like Acme. The search for Mandy was long, but the police, as well as the community, didn't give up. And 3 days into Mandy's disappearance, they found something. Detective Ron Peterson was leading the search team for Mandy, and when he reached Nooksack River, this is about 3 miles away from where Mandy was jogging, on November 27th of 1989, he looked at the water and saw something out of the ordinary. He was sure that he caught a glimpse of pink in the water, and he knew that it wasn't his eyes playing tricks on him. He got closer to the weird pink thing sticking out from under the water, and that was when his heart sank. He was looking at a pair of sneakers. But it wasn't just a pair of sneakers. Someone was wearing those sneakers, and said someone was submerged in the water in the middle of this river. When Detective Peterson dragged the mass out of the water, he was shocked to see a young woman's disrobed and lifeless body. He didn't need any identification to know that who he was looking at was the lifeless and cold body of 18-year-old Mandy Stavik. What everyone dreaded tragically came true. They were no longer dealing with the missing person case. This was now a homicide investigation, and they needed to find a culprit as soon as possible, but that would be easier said than done. Mandy's body was taken for a forensic examination and an autopsy, and it revealed tragic results and was a terrifying picture of what Mandy endured before she lost her life. Mandy lost her life by drowning, and unfortunately she was taken advantage of beforehand. This wasn't a murder, this was a full-blown tragedy. She had several defensive wounds on her body, as well as scratches which the investigators believe she sustained while trying to run away from her assailant, when she got caught in some thick and thorny blackberry bushes. Unidentified male DNA was also found on Mandy's body, but the technology wasn't as advanced as it is now to catch the murderer with just that. The detectives needed more information about Mandy and who she was and who she may have been with during her final moments. The discovery of Mandy's body was the start of a long investigation with hundreds and hundreds of tips, confusion, dead ends, and a soul-crushing 3 decades to find answers for Mandy's inexplicable murder. The investigators started with people who were close to Mandy, any male friends, admirers, and even her boyfriend at the time, Rick. The detectives had to go through all the possibilities before they could move on to the next person of interest, but it was all in vain. In total, about 30 men all over Acme gave their DNA to help investigators match the sample found on Mandy's body, but nothing promising came up. There were also various tips coming in every day. Some people claimed that a local drifter had abducted Mandy. Some said they saw Mandy earlier that day before she went missing, but still, nothing useful ever came up. The police checked every single lead. It wasn't like they had much choice because they had very little to go on in this investigation. So tips, witness statements, and all that were all they had at the time. They were quite literally grasping at straws. Any slight inkling of a lead, they pursued it to its very end, but it was beginning to feel like their efforts would never be enough. The killer left virtually nothing behind, so without some sort of witness statement or some sort of confession, the chances of finding Mandy's killer, well, it wasn't looking good. A reward of $25,000 was set up for any leads in making a successful arrest for the perpetrator, but even that led detectives nowhere. Mandy's case was hitting one dead end after another. If the promise of a life-changing $25,000 wasn't enough to get someone to come forward, then what would it take? Police were at a loss as to how to proceed from here. They couldn't just let the case go cold because there was far too much riding on this, the safety of the local townspeople being the main thing. There were many leads in Mandy's case, almost too many to count, but they all led nowhere. Days turned to weeks, weeks into months, and then months into years, and Mandy's case, unfortunately, went cold but it wasn't forgotten. It could never be. It was such a tragic and shocking incident that it shook the whole community, and they remembered it for decades. But without any promising or believable leads, the investigation died down. Mandy's case had gone cold for over 2 decades, but in June of 2013, everything changed. Police had been begging for answers for well over 20 years at this point, and on a warm June afternoon, they would finally get the answers they were looking for, when 2 women, completely out of the blue, walked into the police station with some information that would blow this case wide open. It was June of 2013 when the investigators were approached by 2 mothers who lived near Bellingham, Washington, and they just had a weird feeling they couldn't shake off. It all started with a day out at Birch Bay water slides. Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson were sitting on the grass chatting with one another as they watched their kids play in the water and slip down the slippery water slides. Even though Mandy's murder was 2 decades old at this point, it was still the talk of the town. People would look back on that haunting day and get goosebumps because Mandy's case was still unsolved even after all this time, and no one had been caught yet. That was until the 2 women approached the police with a very strange story. They were thinking back on the day that Mandy disappeared all those years ago, and they remembered one very strange occurrence they both had with the suspicious man. Both women had spoken with this man on 2 separate instances. These 2 conversations taking place before and after Mandy's murder. But the incidents left the women feeling very shaky, and they just had a hunch about this eccentric and weird man. His name was Timothy Bass. He was a student at Mount Baker High School back then, just as these 2 women had been. Marilee remembered Tim knocking on her door one night a few years after Mandy's murder. She was married at the time, and she was home alone with her baby while her husband was away for work. Marilee was surprised to see Tim at such an odd hour of the evening. Heck, she was a bit shocked to see him at all. He looked disheveled, and he asked to use her phone so that he could make a call. Marilee let him in, but soon realized that that phone call was just an excuse. He just wanted inside of her home. He leisurely walked around the house from the kitchen up to the bedroom, and when he finally returned to face Marilee, she knew in her gut she was in trouble. After all these years had passed by since high school, Tim, at this moment, proclaimed his love for her and expressed his desire to be with her. I guess he must have missed the fact that Marilee was now married and with a kid, even though the home had been filled with pictures of Marilee and her husband as well as their new baby. But whatever this was, Marilee was disgusted and very uncomfortable during this exchange, and she threatened to call the cops on Tim if he didn't leave. She was in so much shock that she didn't even remember how she got Tim out of her house, but luckily she did. And Marilee was unharmed, albeit extremely scared and uncomfortable. And I mean, can you blame her? She was all alone in her house with a baby, and this creepy dude thought that now was the perfect time to express his feelings for her. This whole thing was just bizarre, and it didn't make any sense. Well, after hearing Marilee's story, Heather shared her own story. She had an interaction of her own with none other than Tim Bass. Heather's incident occurred right before Mandy's murder, when she was 15 and Tim was 21. Heather was driving home from a softball game with Tim and another young man named Dan. She remembered Tim staring intensely at her to the point where he, out of nowhere, aggressively complimented her eyes. If that wasn't enough, he then caressed Heather's bare knee with a pin, which just made this poor girl almost turn inside out. She was repulsed by this guy, but he was clearly trying to make a move. After this, she deliberately avoided Tim because, spoiler alert, he was a creep. Well, all this time later, the 2 women, years and years after Mandy's attack and murder, were hit with a feeling. Could Tim Bass be behind Mandy's murder? Was it possible? They didn't have any reason to suspect Tim would be capable of such a thing other than the fact that he was gross and happened to be in the area at the time. But something about him, they just couldn't push out of their minds. The women felt responsible to at least say something. They wanted to know whether Tim was the culprit or not, and really, it was just for their peace of mind, if anything. If Tim was somehow responsible for Mandy's murder, then they wanted to see this man face the consequences. So they reached out to investigators on Mandy's case, and when investigators heard the name Tim Bass, it was safe to say that they were floored. Tim Bass was now on the detectives' radar. Aside from being an Acme resident, Tim actually lived close to Mandy, 2 miles away to be exact. And to make things even more eerie, his house was along Mandy's usual running route, so he would have easily seen her running that day. And investigators wanted to talk to him to see if he remembered anything unusual about that day. For some reason, Tim was never on the police's radar during Mandy's investigation, at least not until now. They didn't even take his DNA at the time of mass testing, but the detectives had a good reason for not suspecting Tim. He was your typical Mr. Nice Guy. He kept to himself, and he and his family were well liked in the community. And as of present, he was married with 3 children, and he worked as a delivery driver. Well, when the police knocked on Tim's door in 2013, he answered, and when detectives asked about Mandy Stavik, he didn't even remember her. Now, this was shocking to the police because, as I said, Mandy's case was anything but forgettable. Even after all these years passed by, her case was still the talk of the town. You couldn't possibly live in Acme and not remember. It just wasn't possible. Everyone remembered that tragedy that befell the Stavik home, even after all these years had passed, so to see Tim trying his hardest to remember Mandy, it was a red flag for the police. Heck, even the people who weren't born yet when the crime took place very clearly knew the case. Tim's short-term amnesia finally subsided, and he faintly remembered her as, quote, the girl found in the river. He was very detached and emotionless and wasn't the least bit bothered about the young woman that lost her life. The investigators also asked Tim if he was ever in a relationship with Mandy at any point before her murder. Tim thought long and hard before finally answering that he wasn't. He flat out denied being in any sort of physical or romantic relationship with Mandy. And remember this bit because it'll come back up later. Well, after this interaction, the detectives asked for his DNA, but Tim refused. He reasoned with the police, saying that he wasn't comfortable giving his DNA because he didn't want to be framed for a crime that he didn't commit. Again, this was weird to the police. Now, sure, he wasn't required to give his DNA, but if he had nothing to hide, then why would he be so defensive? Well, the detectives decided to leave Tim be for now, but they tracked his every move. If Tim wasn't going to hand over his DNA willingly, then the detectives would take it by themselves, one way or another. Now, Tim, growing up, was defined as a loner, but when he reached adolescence, he was known for being extremely angry, erratic, and emotional. He wasn't social, and after a nasty breakup with his girlfriend, which escalated to him threatening to end his own life, Tim developed an inexplicable resentment towards women. Tim eventually married a woman named Gina, and her life basically went to shreds after tying the knot. Tim showed his true colors to Gina, emotionally and mentally abusing her and making her miserable. But since Gina had nowhere to go, she put up with Tim's terrible behavior and abuse. Interestingly, Tim married Gina just a few weeks following Mandy's murder. The detectives were sure that Tim could be their guy, but to be 100% certain, they needed that DNA sample, and luckily someone came to the police's aid. It was Tim's boss, a woman named Kim Wagner. She agreed to cooperate with the police to help retrieve Tim's DNA. So from that point on, Kim loomed over an unsuspecting Tim, and one day, 3 months later, she saw her chance. Tim was drinking a can of Coca-Cola, and he threw the can away in the trash. Tim was feeling generous that day because he also drank from a plastic cup and threw that in the trash too. Kim saw this as a golden opportunity, and she pounced on the trash like a treasure waiting to be claimed. She gave all these things to the police, they ran tests, and what do you know, Tim's DNA matched the male DNA found on Mandy from over 25 years ago. Tim didn't have any reason to have his DNA all over Mandy's body, unless he was the one who attacked and murdered her. And well, the detectives believed that too. So 50-year-old Tim Bass was ultimately arrested in December of 2017, 3 decades after Mandy was murdered. He was charged with kidnapping, assault, and murder. Mandy's mom, Mary, was given the news on her birthday, and let's just say she got the best birthday present of her life. I mean, can you imagine being in Mary's shoes, waiting for 28 years to finally see your daughter's murder in handcuffs? 20 years is a lot, even for the strongest of people. And without sugarcoating anything, Mary did lose hope at times. She was certain that Mandy's murder would make the long list of the nation's cold cases, but thankfully that didn't happen. Mandy and her family were about to get justice. But not before Tim faced trial, because you guessed it, he pleaded not guilty. The trial for Mandy's murder was held 28 years following the actual crime, which is just insane on its own. But instead of owning up to taking the 18-year-old young woman's life, Tim played the most unexpected card. And let me warn you, it'll make your blood boil. At Tim's trial, the detectives argued that Mandy was abducted by Tim, who saw her through his window, maybe even daily. It's believed that he subdued her by striking her on the head while she was jogging, and it's even believed that he attacked the poor dog Kyra too. Tim then took her 3 miles away from her jogging trail, where he then took advantage of her. The prosecution is certain that Mandy fought for her life and even managed to escape at one point, but he eventually and tragically overpowered her. And in the end, he took her life underwater and left a lifeless Mandy in the middle of the river, like she meant nothing, tossed aside like an empty Coca-Cola can. Tim's DNA on Mandy's body is enough proof that he was the one behind Mandy's sudden and savage attack. There's no way around this. But Tim's defense dropped a bombshell, which honestly no one expected. And that was the fact that Tim and Mandy were in a secret relationship at the time of Mandy's murder. And they met up frequently for casual physical relations, which explains Tim's DNA on Mandy's body, and why she jogged that specific route each day. This disgusting man would do anything to free himself from the hands of the law. He truly believed he could slander Mandy's name like this and get away with murder scot-free. Well, Tim was in for a surprise because he didn't plan his story well enough. Remember when the police first talked to Tim in 2013, when he was having a hard time remembering who Mandy even was, and he swore up and down they never had a physical relationship before? Well, it was time for Tim to eat his own words because he was obviously just caught in a lie. He had a hard time remembering his apparent lover because the quote affair never happened. Tim did all of this just to save his own skin and give the grieving family even more pain. This guy was a piece of work. No evidence could corroborate Tim's wild version of events. No phone calls, no mutual friends, no being seen together, nothing. Mandy and Tim were strangers. In the end, Gina, Tim's now ex-wife, also testified, and her statement was pretty much the blow that sank Tim's ship. Gina testified that she heard Tim pleading with his mom to save him by telling the detectives that it was Tim's dad who murdered Mandy. It takes a lot for someone to throw their own father under the bus, but this guy exceeds all extremes in the worst possible way. And if that wasn't enough, Tim also tried to get his brother on his side by slandering Mandy even more. Tim's brother, Tom, also took the stand and testified that Tim told him in 2015 that he was in a physical relationship with Mandy before she was murdered. But there's more. Tim wanted Tom to tell the police that Mandy was also physically involved with Tom. Tim basically wanted to paint Mandy as a two-timer, just to slander her name and turn the whole case into some confusing mess. But in the end, on May 24th of 2019, the jury came back with a verdict. Tim Bass was found guilty on all charges. The courtroom broke out in tears of relief and happiness. This was 30 years worth of investigation, and back and forth, and so much pain and stress, but it was all worth it. Tim was sentenced to 27 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence in this case because he wasn't charged with premeditated murder. This may still be long enough to ensure that he never sees the light of day again. The way this case unfolded, I'm sure a lot of us thought that it would stay a cold case forever, stuck in time with no answers, no closure, and seesawing between hope and despair. But luckily, thanks to the investigators who didn't let Mandy and her family down, this case was finally closed, and the perpetrator is now behind bars. Truthfully, it was largely thanks to Tim's manager, Kim, who put her own safety on the line to help the detectives gather DNA evidence. It was also thanks to the two women, Heather and Mara Lee, who had that aha light bulb moment and decided to talk to the police about Tim's involvement, his skin-crawling behavior, and his antics. It was thanks to Special Prosecutor David McEachran, who retired after 44 years of service in courthouses, but he came back and led Mandy's case and eventually won in the end. It was thanks to the community, who didn't let Mandy's memory die with time. To the contrary, her case only got more potent with time, and this was what led to the case finally getting closed. But most of all, it was the resilience and determination of the Stavik family, who even after 3 decades continued pressing for answers. Mandy didn't deserve to have her life ended abruptly like this. She had so much to look forward to, dreams to accomplish, and many pages to turn in the different chapters of her life. But at the end of the day, we can't spend our time caught up in what could have been. The main thing that matters is that this man is locked away in prison, and he will never be able to hurt a single soul ever again. The search for Lisa Holm was the largest missing person search in the history of Skövde, if not Sweden. The 17-year-old girl had gone missing after getting done with her shift at Cafe 40. Sweden was once known for its non-existent crime rate, but with Lisa's disappearance, things were about to change. What happened to Lisa was beyond horrific. Just 5 days after Lisa vanished, her body would be found, and the media quickly dubbed her case the Milking Room Murder, for reasons that, well, you'll have to hear to believe. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week. So if you're into that kind of thing, and let's be honest, if you're watching this video, you probably are, be sure to hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost anything and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. Lisa Holm was born in Skövde, England. Lisa had always been fond of traveling, and she wanted to study abroad in Australia, and she was defined as a kind, lively, positive, and loving person. She was very helpful towards other people, and she loved the thought of being independent. This is why when Lisa was just a teenager, she started working various part-time jobs to earn some money. A few weeks before the events of today's case, Lisa had gotten a job at a cafe in Blomberg. The cafe was about 40 minutes away from her home, and one of her parents took Lisa to and from work each day. Since this was the first time Lisa was working so far away from home, her parents wanted to be the ones to drop her off and pick her up for their own peace of mind. But on June 7th of 2015, it had been just a few weeks since Lisa had started working at the cafe, and she was confident she could now go to work on her own. But tragically, the very first day that Lisa gained her independence would be her last. Lisa's parents had gotten her a moped for traveling to and from work. Even though her parents were a bit apprehensive about letting her go to work on her own, they knew how important it was for Lisa to experience this on her own. So on June 7th of 2015, Lisa grabbed her stuff, hopped into her moped, and headed to the cafe without any problem. The cafe was busy, people were going in and out, and time flew by. Before Lisa knew it, the clock struck 6 p.m. and it was time to wrap everything up, and Lisa sent a text to her dad a little before 6:30 saying she'd be home soon. Back in Skövde, Lisa's parents were happy and relieved that their daughter had finally gotten free from work and she was on her way back. They were grateful that things had gone by uneventfully. But that wouldn't be the case for long. Sometime later, Lisa's dad received a call from Lisa, and when he picked it up, there was something weird on the other end of the line. Lisa's dad kept calling her name, but he heard other people in the background and some disruption like car doors opening and slamming shut before the call got disconnected. This incident put Lisa's parents on edge, but they chalked it up to just being a pocket dial. Maybe Lisa was on her way and her phone accidentally pressed some buttons and called her parents. So they waited for Lisa to come home. But 40 minutes went by, then an hour, and then 2 hours, and Lisa still wasn't home. This was very unsettling for Lisa's family. The ride from Blomberg to Skövde should have taken around 40 minutes, maybe 50 if Lisa was running late, but it had now been close to 3 hours and Lisa hadn't made it back home. So what was going on? Lisa's family constantly called her while waiting on pens and needles. They were sure that Lisa had gotten into an accident or something. So after waiting longer than necessary, Lisa's dad got into his car and made the drive to Blomberg. He was driving slowly, hoping to catch Lisa on the road, making her way back home. But as he got closer and closer to his destination, well, the more fearful he became. There was no sign of Lisa on the way. When Lisa's dad reached the cafe, he looked around for her, and the first thing he saw was Lisa's moped. He was instantly relieved. He immediately thought that Lisa had stayed back with some friends for a little hangout or something. But as he got closer to the moped, he noticed something alarming. Lisa's helmet was still hanging on the side, and her keys were in the ignition. Why would Lisa leave her keys and moped unattended like this, unless the moped had been abandoned? Her dad looked around for a bit more, and when he couldn't find Lisa anywhere, he called the police at around 10 p.m. and reported 17-year-old Lisa Holm missing. While the police were on the way, Lisa's mom called the cafe owner, who also reached the place in no time and started searching for the young employee. The cafe owner stated that her employees were off the clock at 6 p.m., and now it was almost 4 hours later, and Lisa was nowhere to be found, and her moped was seemingly abandoned. It wasn't like the moped wasn't working or had broken down, it was working like a well-oiled machine, and it made no sense in anyone's mind why Lisa would voluntarily abandon her vehicle and go somewhere else. When the police arrived, they immediately came to the conclusion that Lisa was probably abducted, which was a rarity in Sweden, but they had to go through all the possibilities in this young girl's disappearance. The cafe where Lisa worked was located in a small village, and it was secluded, but it wasn't a hotspot for crime per se. It was peaceful and quiet. Well, the police started their search in nearby areas, and search dogs aided in that process. They went from door to door asking if anyone had seen Lisa, and they even checked the neighboring areas that might stand out or look suspicious in some way. They also asked people if they'd seen or heard anything strange, but at this point, there was nothing. Lisa had just vanished into thin air, and no one could find her. As it was getting really late by now, almost 11 p.m. at this point, the police decided to pause the search till the next morning. In the meantime, Lisa's friends and loved ones spread the word about her disappearance on social media in hopes of jogging people's memories and helping them figure out what happened to Lisa. The next morning, the police search resumed, and this time, a man came forward with something. He worked at a barn right across from the cafe, and he noticed a discarded motorcycle glove on the ground of one of the barn rooms. The man immediately turned the glove into the police, and the investigators asked Lisa's parents to identify this glove as Lisa's. And the answer came as an unsettling revelation. The discarded glove indeed belonged to the now missing Lisa. But why was her glove all the way at this barn? What was Lisa doing there? Well, the police believed that she didn't go there voluntarily, and it was possible she may have been taken there against her will, further cementing that abduction theory. The search for Lisa was huge. It was the largest missing person search conducted by volunteers in the history of Sweden, with hundreds of volunteers showing up every day, looking in various places, searching for Lisa. There were even air searches, and everyone was determined to find her. Soon enough, the police, as well as the volunteers, did start to find some alarming clues. See, the police searched a side road that was near the cafe, and within minutes, they were able to find some receipts, a smashed phone screen, and a phone case, among other things. Deeper searches of this roadside led the police to find more parts of that broken phone. Lisa's parents recognized the phone, or parts of it, and the cover as Lisa's. Things were not looking good. Lisa had gone missing, and now her phone was broken to pieces, and her belongings were scattered on the side of the road near the cafe. Over the next few days, Lisa's ID, her moped license, and her house keys were all found dumped on the side of the road, covered in overgrown grass. The same day, a volunteer, who was actually Lisa's dad's friend, had a strange feeling about the barn across the street. As he approached closer to the barn, he noticed something was amiss. The police tape had been ripped off. This was really unsettling, but against his nerves, the man decided to go into the barn, and within minutes, he was able to find a small earring on the floor. When this earring was showed to the police, it was sadly Lisa's. And when they searched around the barn, they noticed soiled walls, which was a really bizarre sight. A sample of the waste was collected because the investigators had a strong inkling that this would lead to some answers, and it turned out it did. Missing People, a local Swedish organization, also joined the search for Lisa, and they searched the barn and other buildings near the cafe. When they reached the place near the barn, they were stopped by two people in a car who told the volunteers that police had already searched that area. Now, this interaction left the workers of Missing People uneasy. Why would some random people try to stop them from searching a specific area for a missing girl? Regardless, after the car sped off into the distance, the workers resumed their search, and they found some things. They found a pink motorcycle jacket, as well as headphones hidden under some branches. The police were called, and sure enough, the jacket and headphones belonged to Lisa. The property was soon littered with police and forensic teams, and that was when they saw something else in the distance. It was a shed. It was really small, and it was used as a changing room for the barn workers. It also looked like someone had been in the shed recently. See, the shed was surrounded by overgrown grass, but the grass leading up to the door looked like it had just been walked on. So the police decided to look into the work shed too. But as soon as they stepped into the shed, they were hit with a disturbing and rancid odor. It was a nightmare inside. They didn't need any more confirmation that something bad had happened there. When the detectives looked around, their eyes went to a cluster of clothing lockers against one of the walls. Most of them were empty and closed, while one was filled to the brim and wide open. The police checked all of the lockers one by one, but as they reached the stuffed locker, they removed the clothing and miscellaneous items inside, and what they saw literally made them jump out of their skin. And they were police officers. They've seen much worse, but this was horrific. Stuffed inside the narrow and tiny locker space was the body of 17-year-old Lisa Holm. She was partially clothed, and someone had used a rope to end her life. The search for Lisa ended in the worst possible way because she'd been attacked so brutally by an assailant, and now she was gone. Her family was immediately notified of the discovery, and to say that they were absolutely shocked was an understatement. Her parents were beside themselves. For the first time, Lisa wanted to go to the cafe on her own and prove to her parents nothing bad would happen, but the literal opposite happened, and in a quiet, safe, and cozy town, no less. Can you imagine how Lisa's parents must have felt? The sheer number of what-ifs going through their minds. What if they persuaded Lisa to let them take her to work? What if they just picked her up despite her saying otherwise? And that phone call that Lisa's dad got. It was all so haunting and heartbreaking. Now that Lisa's body had been found, the police had to catch the perpetrator. Luckily, the police were able to get DNA samples from Lisa's body as well as inside of the shed, and everything was sent for testing. In the meantime, the police wanted to look into the two men who crossed paths with volunteers from missing people at the barn, the ones who said that that area had already been searched by the police. Well, after a bit of poking and prodding, the police managed to uncover who these people were. They were Lithuanian natives, 35-year-old Rios and his brother. They actually didn't even speak Swedish. They communicated in English, which was the same language in which the men communicated with the volunteers. Interestingly enough, the two brothers worked in the same barn that was right across the road from the cafe where Lisa worked. On top of that, the side road where Lisa's belongings were found trashed was the same road that led to the brothers' house. In the house, the two brothers lived with Rios' wife, and they actually talked to the police on the day that Lisa went missing. The fact they spoke English stood out to the police. Another woman came forward and said that a man who didn't speak Swedish approached her in a car and asked for directions in English. He wanted the woman to sit inside the car for a minute so that she could enter the location into his GPS, but the woman obviously didn't get into his car and she just walked away. All of these instances stood out to the police, so they wanted to have a quick chat with these people. When they talked to Rios and his wife, they were quick to come to their defense. Rios said that he was at home the same time Lisa went missing, and his wife, his only real alibi, was in the kitchen prepping dinner. Meanwhile, his younger brother was at home on his computer. The police obviously didn't buy this story, because they thought that they were simply covering for each other and there was no way to tell whether their stories were even true or not. Regardless, the police took DNA samples from all three people, but since they didn't have any rock-solid evidence against them, they were free to go. Well, it wasn't for long because the DNA results from the work shed came in, and they were a match to someone. See, there were many stains on the walls where Lisa's body was found, and to everyone's disgust, it was male DNA. But that's not even the worst part. See, the shed had a small space with a window that overlooked the cafe where Lisa worked, and most of the male DNA was found on that wall near that window. I don't think I need to go into detail about what this suggests, but the DNA found in the work shed matched that of Rios. So from the looks of it, Rios was a pervert and kind of a peeping Tom. He basically spied on female employees, including Lisa, from the window of the shed across from the cafe. And remember those traces of human waste found in the barn? Well, that was also Rios' doing. It was theorized by the police as well as crime scene experts that the perpetrator probably underwent a rush of adrenaline during or after committing the crime and had no control over his bodily functions, and he soiled himself. The nail in the coffin was found in another adjoining room in the barn. It was used as a milking room for cows, and inside they found the same rope that was used to murder Lisa, as well as Lisa and Nereus' DNA all over the room and on the pipe to which the rope had previously been tied. When Nereus' room was searched following the discovery of all this incriminating evidence, detectives found strands of blonde hair that matched Lisa's. Nereus had been caught, but he and his wife were still holding on tightly to their story. They stressed that someone was trying to frame Nereus, and he was not involved in whatever happened to Lisa whatsoever. That was until the police talked to Nereus' younger brother, and he became Nereus' eventual downfall. See, the younger brother was unable to keep up lying to the police, and he came forward and said that in reality, Nereus was not home when Lisa went missing. And according to his wife, and initially even his younger brother, Nereus was at home between 6 and 8 p.m. on the evening of June 7th of 2015. And he only went out after 8 p.m. to go to a local gas station to get some food. Well, this time, Nereus' younger brother had a completely different story. He said that Nereus basically forced his brother to tell everyone that he was home between 6 and 8 p.m., and when he asked where Nereus truly was, his brother began to unfold everything. He said that Nereus had gone missing for most of the evening, and he actually came back home at around 7:30 or close to 8 p.m. that night. His appearance was shaggy, his clothes were dirty as if he'd taken a roll in the dirt, and he immediately took off his clothes and put them in the washing machine, which was unusual behavior because Nereus never washed any of his clothes immediately. They usually just went in the hamper. To make matters worse, when the police checked Nereus' electronics, they found something very disturbing. Nereus frequented adult websites and watched really questionable adult videos, which bordered on being illegal. Even though there was no definitive evidence of Nereus forcing himself on Lisa during the attack, it's speculated that he got a kick out of seeing people suffer and be in pain. And so following these findings, Nereus was arrested for Lisa's murder and was awaiting trial. What was so astounding was that Nereus' wife stood by him the entire time of his trial. She never once believed her husband to be the perpetrator, and the couple even went as far as blaming the younger brother, saying he was the one who murdered Lisa and somehow planted Nereus' DNA all over the place. Well, no one was convinced because the only person who didn't have an alibi was Nereus himself. The prosecution presented their arguments and stated that Nereus had been eyeing the cafe for a long time by the barn window, spying on unsuspecting young women. On June 7th, it's believed that Nereus lured Lisa into his car as she was leaving work, under the pretense of asking for directions. Lisa somehow got into Nereus' car, and that was when she was overpowered. Nereus then drove to the barn where he ultimately ended Lisa's life in the milking room and soiled himself from the twisted excitement of it all. It's believed that he then loaded Lisa's body into his car and then drove to the work shed, getting rid of Lisa's belongings on the dirt road in the process. He then stuffed Lisa's body into one of the lockers, covered it with clothes, and walked out of the work shed all within an hour, which is terrifying to think about. Well, 5 months following Lisa's murder, on November 17th of 2015, the verdict was finally given. Nereus was sentenced to life in prison in Sweden. He was placed in a high-security prison, but he later appealed to be transferred to Lithuania in hopes of reducing his sentence there. He was ultimately transferred to his native country in 2017, and even managed to get a lower sentence, as low as 15 years. But this happiness was short-lived, because his original conviction was reinstated the same year, and he was going to stay behind bars in Lithuania for the rest of his life. Lisa's funeral was held on July 7th of 2015, approximately a month after her murder, and she was laid to rest in Cedars Church outside of Skövde. The Holm family endured a tremendous loss, and they hoped and prayed that their daughter's murderer never gets any mercy. But one more thing would happen, and it would lead to a very unsatisfactory end to this case. I hate that we're still talking about Nereus, who doesn't deserve any more attention, but it was reported that he was picked on and bullied in prison, to the point that he was beaten black and blue. This harassment followed Nereus all the way to Lithuania, too. And I mean, it's definitely kind of a karmic payback, but on April 3rd of 2022, things took a vicious turn when Nereus was found with a fatal wound to his neck while on a walk in prison. He didn't survive, and he passed away on the way to the hospital. It is devastating that Lisa's family had a taste of justice, but just 7 years into that sentence, they'd be left with no more satisfaction at the fact that their daughter's killer was suffering behind bars, because now he was killed by a fellow inmate. Lisa's family, they're just heartbroken. Not only that their daughter's killer got off so easy, but that any of this happened in the first place. For the Holm family, there really wasn't any justice. There wasn't any reprieve. There wasn't any silver lining. They were just met with hurt on top of hurt. But if there is any justice to be had, they can rest easy knowing that Lisa's killer, he may have gotten away with it in this life, but his punishment won't be so light in the next.